Hey, everybody, welcome in. It is another edition of the Houtopia Football Podcast. We're just a few days away from the start of Texans training camp. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see already that we've got a special guest with us for this episode of the podcast. Of course, I'm Sean Pendergast, one half of Payne and Pendergast on Sports Radio 610, and joined by my co-host, as always, the Hall of Famer, my good friend, and our senior columnist at sportsradio610.com, John McClain. And John, we've got a special guest today. 7 years in the NFL. You hear him on Westwood One. You see him on CBS Sports doing college football. And, of course, he is our Audacy NFL insider. Pleased to be joined by Ross Tucker. Ross, how you doing, man?
Doing awesome. Good to see both you guys. I love that they got rid of Payne for John. That's awesome. That's an upgrade right there. So I would love to have been in that meeting. All right, we got a podcast. We got to have a host. Who should be the expert? Well, not Seth. Let's get John McClain. Been covering Houston football forever. Love it.
So Seth, as proportional response, went and started his own YouTube channel, and now he's directly competing with us. So there's that. I still host a radio show with him, Ross. So there's that, for 4 hours a day, as you know, because you've been a great guest on our show from time to time. But it's great to see you too. So let's get right into it, Ross, because training camp's starting in a few days here, and there's no dead time in the NFL. I wanted to start in with you on what I know it doesn't involve the Texans, but it involves a former Texan that people are still have a lot of feelings for here in Houston, and that's DeAndre Hopkins signing with the Tennessee Titans. Wanted to get your thoughts on the impact that you feel like DeAndre Hopkins is going to have for the Tennessee Titans this season.
Thought it was really interesting. Now, first of all, I'm not a big fan or believer in guys, quote unquote, ring chasing. Look, if that's what they want to do with their lives, go for it. But you know how hard it is to know which team's going to win the Super Bowl and be on that team. I mean, everybody says, "Oh, just go to the Chiefs." It's been 20 years since anybody repeated back to back.
Yeah,
it's really hard to do. Okay, and it's also easy to say, "Oh, just go play for the Chiefs, win the championship," or the Bills. The Bills have had Josh Allen as their quarterback for 5 years, starting quarterback. They've been to one AFC championship game. I mean, what? Good luck chasing a ring there, right? So the idea that these guys will sign for less than a third of what Odell Beckham Jr. got to play for these teams, I always thought was ridiculous. I'm glad DeAndre realized that. I think everybody would love to win a championship, but that's really hard to do. What I like about what DeAndre did is, first of all, Nashville's awesome, probably a sensitive subject for you guys, but Nashville is an amazing city. But I think it's more interesting the message that the Titans signing Hopkins sends. Because all offseason, I, like a lot of people, have kind of wondered what is Rand Carthon doing with the Tennessee Titans? I mean, they kind of revamped their whole O-line. They're basically going young and cheap on the O-line, which sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. They take Will Levis high in round 2. So you're like, okay, they're kind of rebuilding. They moved on from Ben Jones and some of the vets on the team. They tried to get by or take a pay cut, thought they might move on from him. They didn't re-sign David Long, etc. But then they made some other moves. They still have Tannehill as their quarterback. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to do both, right? I think the AFC South, let's be honest, is bad enough that Vrabel believes they can kind of retool, rebuild at certain spots and still win the division. I mean, last year, even without Tannehill, they had the lead in the fourth quarter against the Jags in the win in your in game. And if Dobbs doesn't fumble, and they got Dobbs like 2 days before the game, they win the division last year. So I think Vrabel wants to be able to look at Kevin Byard, Jeffrey Simmons, Derrick Henry, some of those guys, and say, we're going to win the division. Then we're going to make a run in the playoffs. And DeAndre Hopkins, I think, really gives them that chance. I don't think the Colts will be great with the rookie quarterback. Texans, the same. So I think Vrabel looks at the Jaguars and says, you know what? If Tannehill's healthy and you get me DeAndre Hopkins, we'll beat the Jags. We'll win that division.
They could win that division. The big problem is Hopkins hasn't done much in 3 years. He's missed 15 games these last 2 years, 9 because of injuries. He never got hurt here. And now he's had 2 different things hurt the last 2 years. You always worry about when a guy gets his age. He just turned 31, and he's certainly capable of being great again. You know, he was great with a lot of bad quarterbacks. He's got one now who's mediocre, and he'll help Treylon Burks more than anybody, because if Hop stays healthy and plays the way he's capable, he'll get a lot of double teams, which means Burks will be singled up.
No, there's no question. And I really think, John, he's not the player he was in Houston, and he's not going to be. But he's still pretty darn good. I mean, I think he caught 70-some balls last year or something, even though he was suspended, missed all those games with different quarterbacks in Arizona. I think he's what the Titans needed, which is if they're loading the box, take some pressure off Treylon Burks. Don't make him have to be the number one stud receiver. He can still grow into that role. I don't think Hopkins is as much of a deep threat as he used to be. Still has great hands. Still really good against zone coverage. Still excellent on the boundary, and gives Tannehill that option he needs, especially on some of those third downs. They have a really good tight end in Chigakonkwo. And, you know, I think they just realized they needed someone reliable. I don't think Hopkins – I'll be really interested to see if anybody doubles him. I don't know that he's a guy that dictates coverage anymore. And if he doesn't, I think he can be productive again.
So Ross, well, the Madden people like him because they gave him a 93. I will say that. I want to shift gears with you here and get over to the Texans. I'm going to answer the question you would normally ask me and Seth when you come on with us is, how are they feeling in Houston about the Texans right now? I'm going to tell you up front, we're way more excited about the Texans now than each of the last 2 years that we've done radio with you. People are super excited here. So I want to get your thoughts on what I think a lot of people think are massive upgrades that they finally made at the head coaching. So the two most important spots, head coach and quarterback. What are your thoughts about DeMeco Ryans and the combination of DeMeco Ryans and CJ Stroud for this rebuilding team?
Well, DeMeco Ryans is like a unicorn, man. I don't know that I can ever think of another player who every organization he's been associated with just oohs and ahs with their praise for this guy. I mean, I don't even remember how many years he was in Philly. They love him. Like, they love DeMeco Ryans. And I'm not sure what he does to ingratiate himself this much. I mean, I think he was a pretty good player for the Eagles. I don't think he was a great player for the Eagles, but the way he goes about his business, I'll never forget Chip Kelly when he was the coach here. He totally butchered the Lion King. You guys got to Google this. But he called DeMeco like Mufasa or Simba or something. He called him somebody he wasn't. But what he was trying to say is that, like, DeMeco's our guy. DeMeco's I think maybe he called him Scar, the bad guy, or maybe he called him Simba. I don't know. But that just goes to show how respected he is everywhere he's been. I mean, John probably knows more than I do, but seems like Denver really wanted him to be their head coach over Sean Payton. Really wanted him. But he wanted to come to Houston. I think that speaks well to the franchise, to Nick Caserio, that even after back-to-back one-and-done guys, that DeMeco still felt like Houston was the place for him. As for Stroud, really curious to see how things go for him. You know, I think the Georgia game helped tremendously because it showed he can run a little bit. Sometimes you'll wonder, you talk to people, and I never knew he could run. And I think some of these guys, they don't want to be known as running quarterbacks. So they don't run even though they can. And quite frankly, at Ohio State, he didn't have to. I think the learning curve for him, similar to Haskins, similar to Justin Fields. You ever watch an Ohio State game the last couple of years? It's unbelievable. Like 2 years ago, Stroud's first year, every time I flipped the Ohio State game, Chris Olave would catch a post for a touchdown, and there was nobody within like 20 yards of him. I'm like, who are they playing right now? It's like, oh, okay, that's Northwestern. They're actually not bad. Like they're playing decent teams. Guys are wide open. The receivers are unbelievable. clean pocket. Their tackles are Paris Johnson. They're always going in the first round. I think the supporting cast and the surrounding is so good at Ohio State that I think it really is a big adjustment for some of these recent Ohio State quarterbacks when they come in the NFL and the receivers aren't wide open and it's not a clean pocket. I think that'd be adjustment for everybody, but I think it's stark contrast for those guys.
That's a great point, Ross, about those players that he played with. The thing about his running ability, he had 72 yards against Northwestern. He ran, but he said at the combine, why would I want to run when I have so many great receivers who are open? If I'm selfish and I'm running the ball, I'm never going to hear the end of it from them because they're open. My job's to get them the ball. So he proved several times in his 2 years as a starter that if he needed to run, he could run.
So funny too, isn't it, John? Because it was like 10 years ago that we were saying to these guys, better not run in the NFL. Better not. You're going to get hurt. Yeah. These guys that run in college, it's not the way the NFL is. It's like totally flipped. Now it's like, you better run sometimes. I mean, and it works. You know, Hurts had an unbelievable year for the Eagles. Even Daniel Jones ran for over 700 yards, 7 touchdowns, a huge part of the Giants' success last year. And honestly, guys, it's not even the quarterback running as much as it's the threat of the quarterback running and what that creates for the offense.
So, Ross, I want to make sure before we get you out of here, because I know your time is limited, I want to make sure, I think the other, aside from the Texans, the other team or player that Texan fans still have direct interest in, because that's the first round pick the Texans have next season is Cleveland's. Do you think that Deshaun Watson, who was not good in the 6 games he played last year, and he hadn't played in nearly 2 years at that point, do you think Deshaun Watson has a bounce back year in Cleveland this year?
Yeah, so I actually have a question for you guys then after I answer this. The answer is yes, I do think he'll have a bounce back year. I think, having a full year in that system will help him. The O-line's healthy. They have Nick Chubb to run the ball. They did add to the receiving core with Elijah Moore. I think Watson, look, they have to. I'm actually surprised the Browns didn't sign Hopkins, because I think that the head coach and the GM in Cleveland are on the hot seat. I thought as a result that they would pony up the money to get Hopkins there to reunite him with Watson. I think he'll have a bounce back year. I don't think he'll be a top 5 quarterback. Really hard to be that. And I think he was his last full season in 2020, which leads me to my question for you guys. He was unbelievable in 2020. By all accounts, a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. They won 4 games. How is that possible? John, I'll let you go first, but how is that possible? Like, in today's NFL, there is no way you should have a top 5 quarterback and only win 4 games.
They had a terrible coaching. They went through firing Bill O'Brien, and they had a terrible defense that was one of the worst in history against the run. They couldn't stop anybody. And I'll tell you this about Watson. Every game he played here, he played in indoors. He played in Jacksonville, indoors in Indy, good weather at Nashville. Every game will be outdoors in his division. He's never been a good cold weather quarterback. And so I don't think he'll ever compile the stats that he had here. They haven't had a 4,000-yard passer since Brian Sipe. And that was back when I started covering the NFL 47 years ago. So I think he'll be great. They'll run the ball more than they ran the ball here. His stats won't be as good, but hopefully for the Browns and their fans, they'll win games and maybe be a playoff team again.
Yeah. Yeah, Ross, there's nothing much to add to John's thing, except that it was the season after. That was when they traded DeAndre Hopkins. They made Anthony Weaver the defensive coordinator, and poor Anthony Weaver in this whole thing, man. Like, their improvements to the defense were letting DJ Reader walk, overpaying Whitney Merciless, and signing Eric Murray, who nobody knew who he was. You had to Google Eric Murray, the safety. Like, it was bad. It was the gateway to this horrible period of annual coaching searches in Houston. thankfully, that tradition appears to be over. I think we're not going to have, for the first time in years, we won't have a coaching search in the offseason.
Well, man, I hope so. I mean, because that's been ridiculous. I'm still waiting for the McNairs to hire me for 1 year on like a 4 or 5 year contract. I'll sign up for that right now. I only want to coach 1 year.
Yeah.
Then fire me. Then I'll go do something else.
You can get all the churrascos you can eat after that, right?
Exactly.
Let me point out,
Exactly. Delicious.
everybody that watched Texans those 2 years knew that they did terrible coaching jobs and understood why they were fired.
Yep. Ross, we know you got to get out of here. You've got the Ross Tucker football podcast. You got your little podcast empire going on over there, right?
I'm trying, man. We need you guys to get legalized betting down there for the Even Money podcast. For fantasy football, we got the Fantasy Feast podcast, and it was real fun talking about the 2024 quarterback prospects on the College Draft podcast. It's interesting to hear people talk about how much better Drake May and Caleb Williams supposedly are than CJ Stroud and Bryce Young. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll find out someday. We'll find out for sure. Ross, appreciate you, man. Keep up the great work. Appreciate you jumping on with us. Our Audacy NFL insider, Ross Tucker. We'll talk soon, man. Thanks for coming on, brother.
Great. See you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ross.
Right. Good stuff. All right, again, big thanks to Ross Tucker, Audacy NFL insider, joining us here on the Houtopia Football Podcast. A reminder, too, we're not going to do a mailbag today because we had Ross on, but houmailbag@gmail.com. I can guarantee you we will do a mailbag next week, either on Monday or Wednesday. The podcast, that's when we're recording, and Wednesday is going to be recorded after the first practice. So there will be one next week. We want you to mail in the questions. It's been a while since we've done one, so we probably got a backlog. But with training camp coming up, we know you guys have a ton of questions. It also gives us a good idea of what you want us to watch out for at training camp as well for you. So houmailbag@gmail.com. John, I know there's a ton of things we look to get into with Ross. We only had limited time with him, but we can talk about some of them here. You've got a piece up on sportsradio610.com right now, John. 10 things the Texans are looking to accomplish at training camp, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into a few. We can't get into all 10, but if you want to read about all 10, you can go to the website, sportsradio610.com. I think for most fans, I think things begin and end with the QB, the quarterback position this training camp. And I know one of the things that the Texans, in your mind, need to accomplish, they got to figure out the eventuality that CJ Stroud is going to be the starter for this team sooner rather than later, right?
He's got to go in and pick up where he left off in the off-season program and seize that job by outplaying Davis Mills. And because we all know that he's going to be the starter, Davis Mills knows it, Case Keenum knows it. It's the Texans know it. They just don't want to say so yet. But I think when they come out of the joint practices against the Dolphins and the Saints, and before that last preseason game, they'll announce him as the starting quarterback. Because otherwise, D'Amico's going to get asked about it every single day after practice.
Yeah, I just don't want to see him splitting reps evenly in those joint practices, John. That's my big thing. I think that those joint practices, to me, are going to be as big, if not a bigger opportunity to improve and see what you really have. You and I have watched joint practices that are more competitive than those preseason games sometimes. So I would like for, and again, I think we should point out the joint practices are coming before the second and third preseason games. It's only a 3-game preseason. They're coming before the second and third preseason games. So I'm fine if they go into the New England game, that first preseason game, and maybe they haven't named a starter yet. If they name him the starter, what practice is next Wednesday, the first one, they can name him the starter Thursday, and I'd be fine with that too. But to me, it's imperative if he's going to be the starter, unless he's just completely pooping the bed in the first week of practice. He's got to be the starter before those joint practices. That's his best opportunity against the defenses of Miami, the first team defenses of Miami and New Orleans to really improve and learn.
See, that's why I think they'll wait till after those joint practices to see how he does. Because if they were to name him the starter before that and he doesn't do well, then everybody in the media and the fans are going to go crazy. He had bad practices. And that's why I think I don't think it'll be right before the Baltimore game. I think it'd be before that New Orleans game, coming out of the practices. Hopefully sooner the better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess to back up, like I really don't care if they name him the starter before those joint practices. I just want him to get way more of the reps.
Absolutely.
And so whether he's labeled a starter or not, it's not nearly as important as the actual work that goes on. All right. So that's number one. Hang
on one second. Did
Sure.
you see, I can't remember who it was. Somebody I really respect online, NFL expert, had ranking the quarterback rooms in the NFL. And I thought they'd have the Texans like 30th or something, like everybody has them having the second worst record in the league this season to Arizona. And they had the Texans with the 22nd best, which is better than I thought it would be, with Stroud and Mills and Keenum. I thought that both I think that bodes very well from at least that one guy's recognition of what they have.
Well, I think I actually kind of agree with that. If we're rating all three guys as if they're equal somehow, like let's pretend for a second that either one, Case Keenum or Davis Mills, they're very different quarterbacks, obviously, in terms of their experience and their style of play. But they both started a bunch of games in the NFL. Yeah, I would be willing to submit. Let's pretend that Davis Mills is the third string quarterback right now, John, since Case has started multiple seasons for multiple teams and had success in the league. So Davis, based on his body of work, is the third string quarter. You're having a hard time finding third string quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm not saying that Davis Mills has accomplished a ton, like they haven't won a bunch of games, but he's got a ton of very practical experience. Hell, he was a captain. You're going to find very few third string quarterbacks that were the captain of their team, John. That's, you know what I'm saying? Like that's so I actually buy that. The problem with that rationale is that the rating of 22nd is with the hope that 2/3 of that never sees the field, And so I think where that comes in, it would be more important if the Texans were thought to be a contending team this year, because you could be like, all right, well, if they lose CJ Stroud, then the drop off to Case Keenum or Davis and Case give you a chance to still keep winning football games. In a perfect season, CJ Stroud plays 17 games, and I'm not really worried about what the record is necessarily. They're not supposed to be a playoff team. Now, I don't want it to be 2-15, obviously. But if CJ Stroud starts 17 games and they go 6-11 or 7-10, that's probably a successful season for the Texans, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So things the Texans need to accomplish. There's 10 of them. John has them up on sportsradio610.com. Let's do a couple more. The one that you have that intrigues me here is figuring out the workload at running back, and specifically, what is Devin Singletary's role in an offense that was Dameon Pierce heavy in 2022?
I wrote Sean that the signing of Singletary could turn out to be the best free agent signing Nick Caserio had, because he started for the Bills for 3.5 years. He's a good receiver. There's no reason for Dameon Pierce to be in on obvious passing downs. He needs to be on the sideline resting because of the way he plays, a physical style in which he looks for contact, and he's not going to change that. Although on the sideline, they may tell him, run out of bounds instead of trying to hit somebody because you're going to be out anyway. That Singletary could be 65-35, could be 70-30, but it's going to be so much better than it was last year. And I think we would be ignorant to think with a 17-game schedule that a running back's going to go the distance. And then they got to develop a third guy, because if Pierce, who missed almost 5 full games last year, is out with an injury and Singletary's the starter, who's going to be number 3? That's another thing they have to determine in training camp.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the Singletary signing too. It's just he was a good back for Buffalo. To me, I'm more, all the people getting worked up about running back salaries, for whatever reason, it feels like this year more than any other year recently, everybody's worked up about the pay scale for running backs in the NFL, probably because of Saquon and Josh Jacobs. We've got 2 really good top 5 running backs that just can't sniff a long-term deal that they feel is fair. And so it's become a very front burner topic. To me, it's the guys like Saquon Barkley is going to somehow wind up making 20 or 30 million the next couple of years, one way or another. To me, Devin Singletary, it's a good NFL running back. He's a starting NFL running back for a playoff team, a good playoff team the last couple of years. He gets 1 year, $3.5 million. And again, I'm not crying for someone who makes $3 million for a year of playing a kid's game, but That's the level of running backs. I mean, it's like the actor strike, John. You know this because you're an actor. It's like I'm not crying the blues for the Harrison Fords of the world, or the Charlie Sheens or the Brad Pitts of the world. I'm not crying the blues for them. It's it's the judges in Spring Breakers, John, that the strike is for. Devin Singletary is basically you in Spring Breakers, is what I'm saying.
Thank you. I've been on strike since 2008.
Yes. All right, so we got 2 offensive. Let's get a defensive one in, John, of the things, and it's a really good article, 10 things that the Texans need to accomplish in training camp. On the defensive side of things, look, Will Anderson, who knows, John, Will Anderson might end up being the Texans' best defensive player as a rookie this year. I think it's a very real possibility. Number 3 overall pick, Will Anderson. But what happens opposite of him, that opposite defensive end, where Jerry Hughes was really good last year for most of the year, kind of tailed off. Jonathan Grenard has been a disappointment, mostly because of injuries over the last year or so after a decent season in 2021. How do you think, and how important is it that they get that position hashed out during training camp?
And it's amazing how many players they have competing for positions in the defensive line. They've got so many bodies. You got 2 draft choices in the 1st and 4th rounds. They're both going to make the team. Hughes will be 35. Grenard's in the last year of his contract, and you know how guys have a habit of staying healthy in the last year of their contracts. John led them in sacks 2 years ago with 8, and I think he missed 5 games. Jerry Hughes had 9 last year. Couple he came so close to getting, could have been in double figures. So they need those guys to play. Grenard like he did in 2021, Hughes like he did in 2022. And there will be some kind of rotation, but Will Anderson has a chance to be their first double-digit sack guy since 2018 when J.J. Watt had 16. And he is the favorite to be voted NFL Defensive Rookie of the Year, like Bijan Robinson is favored to be Offensive Rookie of the Year. And I think that Matt Burke, the new defensive coordinator, and D'Amico Ryans will move Anderson around. I would not put him inside very much because he's going to get beat up by guys a whole lot bigger than him. Let him rush off the edge. He's quick. He's fast. He's got great closing bursts. Got good moves with his hands. And so I think he's going to be spectacular. They do too, because they wouldn't have traded so much to move up to get him if they didn't think he was going to be great.
Yeah, and I think he's personality-wise, he feels like a culture fit and a culture changer in some ways, I think, for this team and that defense, that he could be, to this defense. This is high praise because he's the greatest player in the history of the franchise. I think their hope, John, I think what they traded for him, the message that I get with what they traded for him is they feel like he could be to this defense in the 2020s what J.J. Watt was to this defense in the the 2010s, we'll call it here. I'm not saying he's going to be a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year and a Hall of Famer. I'm saying his role in that defense and the level that they need him to play to or aspire to and play at really is Watt-like. Am I out of bounds on that?
No, I don't think so. And he's used to a lot of attention. He started getting it as a freshman at Alabama. He is used to getting double teamed. He's used to getting cheap shotted. He's played in front of humongous crowds. He understands pressure. People had been talking since his freshman year about him being a number 1 pick. And he not only was the best defensive prospect in the draft, some people had him rated as the highest prospect over Bryce Young and other players. And so there's high expectations, and he seems like he's equipped mentally and physically to handle those kind of lofty expectations.
All right, so you can get the whole article, 10 things that the Texans are looking to accomplish at training camp. John McClain's got that up, sportsradio610.com. John, before we get out, let's touch on some Astros because we're going to start to get pretty football heavy here as training camp gets started next week. But this is a pretty crucial week for the Astros, coming off of a split against Colorado. And they find themselves, as you and I are recording this on a Thursday, they find themselves 4.5 games back of the Rangers. The good news is Yordan Alvarez is swinging a bat again. The good news is Jose Urquidy is throwing a baseball again. Hopefully Jose Altuve. In other words, they're hopefully getting healthier here. and they've got a soft chunk of schedule, like right here over the weekend. They've got these 4 games against Oakland, while the Rangers are facing off against the Dodgers. It's really like the rest of this week and then through next week, because they get 3 games with the Rangers at home, and then they've got Tampa Bay at home, who up until a couple days ago, they were the best team in the American League. They're kind of faltering now. But how crucial is this week coming up, this next 7 to 10 days for the Astros and their chances of winning the division?
Rangers are playing great coming out of the All-Star break. They embarrassed the Rays. It's funny, Tampa is on pace for the 2nd worst July in its franchise history. They've just been awful in July. So the Rangers beat them up. So maybe the Astros beat them up. What the Astros got to hope is the Rangers don't come to Minute Maid Park and do to the Astros what the Astros did to them in Arlington, which is humiliate them. And that's a possibility. Thank goodness for Brandon Belak, gave up 1 run, and they salvaged that split with the Rockies. Now they've got to win 3 out of 4, at least, against the A's, because the Rangers have a farm system that's well stocked, and Aroldis Chapman has been fantastic. And they're going to make moves at the deadline to further bolster their bullpen and maybe another starter. And of course, we don't know what Dana Brown is going to do. He says he's going to do something, but the Astros have been so inconsistent. And yeah, Alvarez is swinging a bat. Altuve's hitting off a tee. Urquidy is throwing. But when are those guys going to be back exactly? Yeah. Is it going to be a week? Is it going to be another month? Who else is going to get hurt? If it wasn't for Chas McCormick and Julks and guys like France and Belak pitching better than anybody ever thought they could, and a guy like Jeremy Pena's hitting in the 230s, huge disappointment.
Yeah.
And these other guys are kind of taking up the slack, and you'd like for the guys who are their best players who are healthy to start hitting and pitching better.
Yeah. It's crazy to think, John, like if we're just using the last month or so, like you trust Brandon Belak and JP France more than you trust Christian Javier and Hunter Brown right now.
That's the truth.
That's not even, I'm not even being funny or snarky or anything like that. They empirically, those two have been much better, not just on the level of Javier and Hunter Brown. Thank God they haven't been on the level of Javier and Hunter Brown these last 4 or 5 starts. John, I put up a poll on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it.
I did. I voted.
You voted? Okay. So I'm curious. Then let's reveal your vote here. I know people don't like to talk about who they vote for in elections, John. It's a personal thing, but I think you'll be okay discussing this one on here. The poll that I put up was if the Astros, the season ended today, they'd be in a wild card round. So they'd be the 6th seed. They'd be playing probably the Minnesota Twins in a playoff series in a 2 out of 3. Framber obviously is your unquestioned game 1 starter. Of the guys right now, let's pretend game 2 is tonight. Who do you start? And the 4 choices, obviously the other 4 starters right now: Javier, Hunter Brown, JP France, and Brandon Belak. Who did you vote for, John?
I voted for Javier because I can't imagine he's going to be so inconsistent to terrible the rest of the season. He's pitched in the playoffs. He's pitched well. He has experience. I think that's one thing a lot of Astro fans are thinking, well, if they can just get in the playoffs. Well, to get in the playoffs, you need 3 good pitchers right now. They have 1, Framber Valdez. And even though Framber has had a couple of games that were not up to his speed in the last 2 weeks, but he is the ace. But after that, what are you going to do? Go with France and Belak, Ronel Blanco, Jose Urquidy? Those 2 guys have to come through, and if they don't, they may not even make the playoffs.
But the question is, John, though, if the game was tonight, would you still start Javier over JP France?
I would, just because he has experience in playoff games, and maybe that would mean something to him.
Yeah.
Or all of a sudden he could look up to heaven, and then he'd be like Roy Hobbs. He'd be supernatural and be the Christian Javier we saw last year.
Yeah, that and for what it's worth, I'm looking at the poll right now. If you can go to my Twitter at Sean T. Pendergast, there's still got 18 minutes or 18 hours and 31 minutes to vote in it. It's already up around 12 or 1,300 votes, which is that's usually the amount that I get with my following. I've got about 44,000 followers. That's about the amount I get on a poll that stays up there 24 hours. Astro fans are pretty passionate about stuff like this, so they're getting in there and voting. The current results are Christian Javier, 43%, JP France, 35%.
Wow.
Hunter Brown, 13%, and Brandon Belak, 9%. John, is it more noteworthy that and by the way, when I put this up this morning, I had it open on my computer during Payne and Pendergast. There was a point several hundred votes in where JP France actually took the lead on Javier in this thing. Since then, Javier, his family must have jumped on Twitter and started stuff in the ballot box for him here. But he's 43 and 30. Is it more noteworthy to you, John, that JP France is within 8% of Christian Javier, or that JP France is nearly tripling the support that Hunter Brown is getting right now?
I think Hunter Brown's a bigger story because there was such high hopes for him after last season. And he had some great starts this year. But now he hadn't been worth a darn, going back to 5 or 6 starts, and they're talking about, oh, he's overworked. They always talk about these guys being overworked. And Nolan Ryan, I think Nolan Ryan would laugh about that based on how much they used to pitch. And if he's overworked at this point in the season, basically they started saying that at the midway point, then something's wrong.
Yeah. John, not to sound like not to sound like the average age of the two hosts doing this podcast right now, but I'm with you. Like I think about that a lot. I'm like, man, we didn't ever talk about like workload or the number of innings and all these guys. And there were guys that pitch consistently year in and year out. Like there were extreme examples. Like Billy Martin in the early 80s took an Oakland A's staff that was really, really good and pitched them into the ground because they pitched complete games every time out. Steve McCaddy and Mike Norris and Matt Keogh, and who were like, some of those guys are 20-game winners and they're out of baseball in 2 years because Billy Martin pitched them into the ground. I just don't remember, like, God, did we ever have concern about a reliever having to pitch 2 days in a row, an inning, like throwing 12 pitches each day, 2 days in a row? It's crazy. Never. Yeah. It's just, it's wild to me.
And oh my God, if a guy has to pitch 3 days in a row.
Yeah. Man. Oh, I know. They were ready to give Philip Maton the Purple Heart last week in the Angels series. He had to pitch all 3 games. Look at the courageousness of Philip Maton coming in for an inning in 3 straight Major League Baseball games and then going back to his 5-star hotel room and eating Wagyu beef on room service. So, yeah, that's wild to me. All right, John, before we get out of here, trade deadline is coming up August the 1st. So we're, about 10-ish days away from the trade deadline. As far as like magnitude of trade, I've heard that Dana Brown is taking big swings here with a lot of the talks. I think some of that is symptomatic of the rumors that we've been hearing, how true they are or not, or how real they are. I think they're true rumors. I think the Astros are kicking tires on everything because that's what you should do if you're a GM. How realistic it is that some of those things come to fruition. The bigger the name, the less a chance, just because the Astros, in terms of the currency that you need to compete in this market, the prospect currency, they don't have what the Rays and the Orioles and some of these other teams have to go shopping for what you need at the deadline. And getting some of the names we're talking about, you'd have to disrupt your actual major league roster, which I'm not against doing for certain guys. If you had to like sort of categorize here, like the magnitude of trade that you expect the Astros to make, and they make multiple trades. I get that. I'll just say the magnitude of the deadline, the Astro, like the cumulative magnitude of the deals that they make, with the Verlander being like a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5 back in 2017. Greinke's a 5, right? Future Hall of Famer. Like last year, they trade for Mancini and Vasquez. That's like a 2 or a 3, right? 2 pieces that are just the depth pieces and things like that. What do you expect in terms of magnitude 1 to 5 for the Astros cumulative moves that get made at the deadline here?
When they got Vasquez, he was batting cleanup for the Red Sox, and I thought he would be a lot better here. Problem is he's rotated with Maldonado.
Yeah.
And right now, there was a thing I tweeted this week, a deep dive into the Astros catching by the guy that goes by Climbing Towels Hill.
Mm-hmm.
That was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about Maldi being better with the pitchers, it had every stat laid out about how Diaz has been better. And so Vasquez was not brought in to be the catcher. He's brought in to be the backup. And then Mancini, he didn't hit as well with the Astros that he had with the Orioles or that he is this year. He's nothing special. I don't even remember what team he's with, but I look at it.
Cubs.
At the box scores.
Cubs.
And so I think that Dana Brown's he's going to acquire at least 2 relief pitchers and 1 starter. And I don't think the starter is going to be second or third. I think it'll be a guy who'll be 4th or 5th.
Yeah.
And so that's not going to create a huge buzz. Let's talk about Dylan Cease. If they were going to trade Cease, so many teams could give so many better prospects in the minor leagues, pitching and hitting, that the Astros just don't have.
Yeah. So it sounds to me, John, your 1 through 5 rating here sounds to me like a 2 on a scale
2
of
or
1 to 5.
3.
Yeah,
2
like
or 3.
just kind of a middling trade deadline. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
It's a big 10 days for Dana Brown. So all eyes are on him right now. John, what do you got going on sportsradio610.com?
I also have an Astros column there. My next one that I do for the website will be about the Texans starting camp next week, and then I'll hit the Texans. I'll usually write for a week when the Texans crank it up. Also, we got to remind people August 24th.
Oh, yeah.
Houtopia Football Podcast goes on the road to the Houstonian. You can go on their website, Houstonian.com, go down to events, click on it, and you'll find an event where Sean and I are going to do everything we do on this podcast. We're going to do it for fans at Houstonian on August 24th. So we hope people will sign up.
Houstonian, I just saw, and I bookmarked this so I could send a congratulatory text to our friend Steve Fronterhouse, the general manager. They just got named like the nicest resort spa style hotel, I think in Texas, maybe. I don't know. I should be careful probably about the magnitude that the poll was. It was significant. Like it was, they were the best. And I say all that to say that a big reason why they're so good is because of the food, and that our evening that night, the podcast going on the road, is going to include an incredible 4-course meal
and boo and wine.
Yeah.
And they go all out over there. Steve
Legit.
Farmhouse does. And there's a reason they're one of the best in the country. And so we hope people will sign up and come join us.
It's going to be a fun night to talk football, training camp. All the preseason will be in the books. No, the 2 of the 3 games will be in the books. Hopefully CJ Stroud. There we go, John. Will CJ Stroud be named the starting quarterback by the time you and I are eating delicious steak at the Houstonian on the 24th of August?
I'm going to ask D'Amico to hold up that announcement till right before we do the event. Then we can talk about it.
Then he should and give it to you or me, and we can break the news from the podcast. That would be great. John, good stuff as always, and look forward to talking next week, and obviously seeing you out at training camp next week as well.
Can't wait.
Yep. Should be fun. Appreciate all of you tuning in. Again, administratively here, houmailbag@gmail.com. Send in your questions. We will do a mailbag next week. Either the first or second episode will include your questions. That is a promise, because we haven't done one in a while. So that's the mailbag, houmailbag@gmail.com. Be sure to, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button wherever it is you get your podcasts, and you'll get this podcast sent to you automatically. We're here. Training camp is here. It's next week. This is when you want to be on board getting this podcast served up to you. Big thanks to Ross Tucker for joining us on this podcast as well. Big thanks to James Jackson, our producer, who does a great job getting this baby lined up and out to you in all the different chunks that he sends it out in, both video and audio. You can get the podcast on YouTube as well. So for James, big thanks. For John McClain, the Hall of Famer, I'm Sean Pendergast. We are out of time. We will see all of you next week for the Houtopia Football Podcast. Training camp almost here. Have a great weekend, everybody.